In this episode of Midnight Case Files, we dive into one of the most complex and controversial murder investigations in recent California history, a case that tore apart the image of a wealthy family and exposed a tangled web of love, money, betrayal, and conflicting truths that would ultimately leave a jury divided and the public deeply unsettled. In the spring of 2016, Keith Green, a 27-year-old aspiring chef and devoted father of 2 young daughters, vanished under suspicious circumstances after leaving his temporary residence in Millbrae, California, telling family friends that he was heading out to meet his ex-girlfriend, Tiffany Lee, to discuss custody and financial arrangements, a meeting that would become the last confirmed moment he was seen alive, as Keith, who had been struggling financially and emotionally after his separation from Tiffany, arrived near a closed Pancake House restaurant where the two were expected to talk. But after that night, he never returned home, leaving behind his wallet, car keys, and a growing sense of alarm among those closest to him. Within hours, his disappearance sparked concern, but it would take days before the situation escalated into a full-scale investigation, with early clues quickly complicating the narrative when Keith's cell phone was discovered abandoned on a hiking trail in San Francisco's Golden Gate Park, miles away from where he was last seen, raising immediate questions about how and why his phone ended up so far from the meeting location, especially given that phone records showed erratic movement patterns consistent with travel across the Bay Area. Keith's personal life, once stable, had become increasingly strained following his breakup with Tiffany Lee, a woman from a highly affluent family with substantial real estate holdings valued in the tens of millions, possibly far more, whose wealth and lifestyle stood in stark contrast to Keith's working-class upbringing and financial instability. And although the two had once shared a life together and welcomed 2 daughters, their relationship had deteriorated into bitter disputes over money, custody, and control, culminating in Keith moving out and staying with friends while Tiffany began a new relationship with another man, further intensifying tensions between them. Investigators soon learned that despite their separation, Keith and Tiffany remained in contact due to their children, and on the night of his disappearance, multiple sources confirmed that Keith had indeed gone to meet Tiffany to discuss custody arrangements, while Tiffany herself acknowledged that she had seen him that evening, initially suggesting to police that she believed Keith might have staged his disappearance or was attempting to manipulate her financially. A theory rooted in their increasingly hostile exchanges and Keith's repeated requests for financial assistance. However, as investigators dug deeper, the timeline began to tighten in unsettling ways, particularly when cell tower data placed Keith's phone in close proximity to the Pancake House at around the time of the meeting, followed by movement patterns that aligned closely with Tiffany's Mercedes SUV as it left the area. And surveillance footage further complicated matters by showing a vehicle matching the description of Tiffany's driving along the same route toward Hillsborough shortly after the alleged meeting. Days later, the case took a grim turn, when Keith's body was discovered in a remote field off Highway 101 near Geyserville, roughly 2 hours north of San Francisco, identified through dental records, with injuries revealing he had suffered a fatal gunshot wound to the neck and showing additional signs of trauma, including broken teeth and partial undress, deepening suspicions that his death was not accidental but part of a deliberate act. As the investigation widened, attention turned sharply to Tiffany Lee and her new partner, Cave Batt, a man who had previously been a friend of Keith and later became romantically involved with Tiffany, a development that had already fueled tension long before the murder, especially as financial disputes escalated and Keith reportedly struggled to maintain stability while Tiffany continued living in a multi-million-dollar Hillsborough estate. Investigators uncovered a series of volatile communications between Keith and Tiffany, including recorded phone calls and messages, in which financial demands, emotional accusations, and threats were allegedly exchanged, painting a picture of a relationship that had become increasingly toxic, with Keith requesting substantial monthly support and Tiffany resisting what she viewed as unreasonable demands, while her relationship with Cave appeared to further alienate Keith and intensify conflict. One particularly damning piece of evidence for prosecutors emerged from an alleged exchange between Tiffany and Cave in which they appeared to discuss Keith in hostile terms, interpreted by investigators as potential coordination for harm, though the defense would later argue that these statements were taken out of context and reflected frustration rather than intent. As forensic analysis continued, additional evidence was presented including cell tower pings that suggested Keith's phone had briefly connected to Wi-Fi near Tiffany's residence after the meeting, implying proximity at a critical time window, and surveillance footage that allegedly placed a bodyguard-like figure following Tiffany's vehicle during the night in question, adding another layer of complexity and introducing a third individual into the unfolding narrative. That individual, Olivier Adela, a personal trainer and security figure with a complicated background, eventually became a central and highly controversial witness, claiming that he had been approached by Tiffany and Cave months earlier with a proposal to harm Keith, which he said he refused, only to later become entangled in the aftermath, when he alleged he was coerced into disposing of Keith's body after finding him deceased in a vehicle, a claim that dramatically shifted the direction of the case and introduced the possibility of a coordinated conspiracy involving multiple participants. Adela's credibility, however, would later come under intense scrutiny as investigators uncovered inconsistencies in his background, including questions about his identity, immigration history, and prior legal issues, ultimately leading authorities to conclude that significant portions of his testimony were unreliable, though not before his statements had already shaped public perception of the case and influenced early prosecutorial strategy. Despite mounting uncertainty, Tiffany Lee was arrested alongside Cave Batt and charged with murder, though she would gain national attention for posting an extraordinarily high multi-million-dollar bond secured through family wealth and property assets, allowing her temporary release while awaiting trial, a move that further polarized public opinion. As the trial approached years later, the prosecution initially relied heavily on Adela's testimony, but when his credibility collapsed due to findings of deception and alleged witness tampering, the case shifted dramatically, forcing prosecutors to proceed without their key narrative anchor, instead relying on circumstantial evidence such as phone records, vehicle tracking, blood trace analysis, and disputed forensic interpretations. The defense, meanwhile, argued that the evidence was consistent with a botched kidnapping attempt rather than a premeditated murder, pointing to the absence of a recovered murder weapon, lack of definitive gunshot residue in the alleged crime scene vehicle, and minimal biological evidence linking Keith's death directly to Tiffany or Cave inside the SUV or residence, suggesting instead that Keith may have been intercepted and killed by an external party, possibly including Adela himself. After years of delays, legal maneuvering, and conflicting interpretations of evidence, the case finally reached trial in 2019, where jurors were presented with two sharply opposing narratives, one portraying a calculated conspiracy driven by financial disputes and romantic entanglement, and the other describing a chaotic and poorly executed abduction involving multiple actors and unreliable testimony. In a stunning outcome, the jury acquitted Tiffany Lee of murder charges, while failing to reach a unanimous decision regarding Cave Batt, resulting in a mistrial and ultimately leading prosecutors to decline a retrial, effectively ending the criminal proceedings without a definitive conviction. Shortly after, both Tiffany and Cave were released, leaving Keith Green's death officially unresolved in the eyes of the criminal justice system, a conclusion that ignited public debate and left his family seeking answers through civil litigation rather than criminal conviction. In a later wrongful death lawsuit, a financial settlement was reached in which Tiffany agreed to provide compensation to Keith's mother and daughters, though she had already relocated internationally and maintained her innocence, claiming that media portrayal and public hostility had distorted the truth of what happened that night. Years later, the case remains a haunting example of how wealth, relationships, conflicting testimonies, and incomplete forensic evidence can collide to produce a courtroom outcome that satisfies no one fully, leaving behind only competing theories, unanswered questions, and a lingering sense of unresolved justice. And as always here at Midnight Case Files, we leave you to decide what truly happened on that final night when Keith Green vanished into the shadows of a case that still divides opinion to this day.